Hi guys, today we're going to talk about trig graphing. We're going to review the basics of the sine, cosine, and tangent function, and we're going to talk about the components of the trig equation as well as actually graph. So the first thing you need to know is the basic sine function. So when in doubt, you can graph it out. To do that, you're going to go to y equals, and in y1 you're going to type in sine x. And then you got to check your mode, radians or degrees. If you are in radians, you want to make sure that when you hit zoom 7, which is zoom trig, you know that this is going to be in terms of radians. If you're in degrees, it should be in degrees from 0 to 360 or from 0 to 2 pi, depending on if you're in radians or degrees. If we wanted to see one sine function, we have to know the mode because we have to change our mode from what you see here to, in radians, 0 to 2 pi. So notice I'm making my x minimum 0 and my x maximum 2 pi. And then when I hit graph, you'll see one sine function. So that's why I mentioned the mode in the beginning here, because that is usually we're in radian mode. We're going to stick with radian mode. So sine starts at the midline, which is 0, or the x-axis here, and it goes up like a roller coaster. So I want to make a note, sine, positive sine, starts at the midline, and it goes up to the maximum first and then down to the minimum next. You could tell if you have one full sine curve if when you color it in, you have one full circle. If you slide those two together, you'll get one full circle, one full cycle. Negative sine would just be the same exact thing, but it would go downward first, and it would still start at the midline. So if you want, you could graph negative sine as well, to remind yourself that that one's just going to go down first, but it will still start at the midline. Positive cosine, let's see what it looks like. Positive cosine is going to be cosine x. If we hit graph, you see it starts at the maximum. So it's going to start at 1, and it's going to make a V. Remember, it has 5 total points: maximum, midline, minimum, midline, maximum. This one also had 5 total points. So positive cosine starts at the maximum. Thus, negative cosine will start at the minimum. Okay? Now, the tangent is the one that's kind of weird. Remember, it has asymptotes, and it has asymptotes because tangent is defined as sine over cosine. So when you graph it, you're going to see that it looks quite different than the rest. So I want to mention that we have asymptotes. They are called vertical asymptotes. Remember, tangent is sine divided by cosine. So wherever cosine equals 0 is where the tangent will be undefined. So that's at pi over 2, which is 90 degrees, and at 3 pi over 2, etc., negative 90 degrees. So I'm going to put a dotted line here wherever there's an asymptote, and then I'm going to show the graph. It approaches but never touches the asymptote. Tangent is the least likely to be seen as a graph on your regions. Now the equations. So the equation of sine and cosine are represented with constants in front of the different parts of the equation. The A represents the amplitude, that is the number in front. The B represents the frequency, that's the number in front of the x. The C, because it's inside the parentheses, it's attached to x, it represents a horizontal shift, which is also called a phase shift sometimes. And that is less in our curriculum than it used to be. And then the D in the back plus D represents the midline, which is actually a vertical shift, up or down. Okay, so I just want to remind you we went over it's alphabetical A, F, M, or if you want to throw in the horizontal shift, it's A, F, H, M. A, F, H, M, where F is the frequency. Okay, so if you like, you can use that as well. The B is the frequency. All right, so the vocabulary now. So the midline is that middle line. It's actually the average between the maximum and the minimum. And the formula is the average of the maximum and the minimum. So maximum plus minimum divided by 2. You add them up and you divide by 2. The amplitude is the distance to the midline. So I like to do maximum minus midline or I could do midline minus minimum. Some teachers do 1/2 of maximum minus minimum. I tend to go away from that because I don't want you to be confused between the midline and the amplitude formula. The maximum is the highest point and the minimum is the lowest point. To get the maximum, we do midline plus amplitude. And to get the minimum, we do midline minus amplitude. The frequency is the number of times we see the full curve in a 2 pi interval. So how many full curves or cycles we see in a 2 pi interval? In a 2 pi interval. Okay, it doesn't have to be 0 to 2 pi. It could be negative pi to pi, so keep that in mind. The formula for frequency is 2 pi divided by the period. The formula for period is 2 pi divided by the frequency. The period of the curve is how much space along the x-axis that one full curve takes up. And the quarter points are what we're counting by along the x-axis. And to get that, you do period divided by 4, aka quarters. All right, let's do some questions. First one. Which function has a maximum of 4 and a midline of 1? So take a minute, pause the video, and see. So the first thing I want you to do is eliminate choice 1 and 2 because those are not trig curves at all. And because it has arrows on the graph either going up or down, that's actually not going to have a midline of 1, even though you might think it does, because it's going on infinitely, either down toward negative infinity in this case, or up towards positive infinity. So we don't want those. We're looking for a trig curve only when it's talking about the midline. So we're down to choice 2 or 4. Now, if you put in AFM, amplitude, frequency, midline here, you see that the number in the back, 1, is the same for both 2 and 4. So that's not helpful. But we want to find a maximum value of 4. So to get the maximum, we're going to do midline plus amplitude. All right, so if we do choice 2, if we do 1 plus the amplitude, we have to remember that amplitude is always positive. So the absolute value of -3 is 3, so we're going to get 1 plus 3, which is indeed 4. And the answer is choice 2. If you picked that, good job. If you're doing choice 4, you're going to do 1 plus 4 for the maximum, and that's going to be 5. So that's why it's not choice 4. Number 2, let's take a look. The average monthly temperature of the cities can be modeled by a cosine graph. Melissa has been living in Phoenix, Arizona, where the average temp is 75. She'd like to move to a location where the average temp is 62. When examining the graphs, what should she focus on? So as soon as you see the word average, which one are you going to pick? I'm hoping you said midline because midline represents the average y value. Number 3. We have a curve. It says it's a cosine curve, so we know it's cosine. It starts at the maximum, so indeed it is a cosine curve. It says, what are the values of A, B, and C? So stop the video right now and see if you could figure out, first, what's the midline, then what's the amplitude, then what's the period, and then what's the frequency. I actually think about things in that order, so do that now, stop. So the maximum is 5, the minimum is 1. So to get the midline, we could do the average of the maximum and the minimum, which is 5 plus 1 divided by 2, and that's 3. I'm hoping you realize that the midline is 3, even just looking at it. So remember, the midline is the number all the way in the back of the equation. That's actually the C. So right away, we know the midline is the C is 3. So if you look at the choices, just using process of elimination, you know that we're only down to choice 1 or 4. So cross out 2 and 3 before you do anything. The next thing I'm going to do is find the amplitude. The amplitude is the distance from the maximum to the midline or from the minimum to the midline. So I could either do 5 minus 3 and I'll get 2, or I could do 3 minus 1 and I'll get 2. So the amplitude is basically half of that vertical distance. So the amplitude is 2, which means that A is 2. Right away, I know the answer has to be choice 1 before I even do anything further. But let's take a further look into the period and the frequency. The period is how much space one full curve takes up. This is a cosine curve. Cosine goes from maximum back to maximum. So if we were to put in the 5 full points, this would be one full cosine curve. The length along the x-axis that that one full curve takes up is pi over 3. So the period of this one full curve is this whole chunk here along the x-axis is pi over 3. Period does not show up in the equation. Frequency shows up in the equation, N for B. So to get the frequency, we have to do 2 pi divided by the period. 2 pi divided by pi over 3 is equal to 2 pi times the reciprocal, which is 3 over pi. We end up getting 6. So the frequency is 6, and that is indeed what choice 1 says. Now we get into one that's a little trickier because it doesn't give us a picture. So we have to kind of sketch the graph in our head. It says the graph of 3 sine 1 half theta over the interval. What does it do? Okay, so you know what? I think we should graph it in y equals. So go to y equals right now and type in the equation 3 sine 1 half. Instead of theta, put an x inside the parentheses. Then you want to fix your mode. Again, make sure it's in radian mode. And then you want to fix your window to be exactly the window that they're saying here, which is negative pi to pi. So you're going to make your x minimum negative pi. You're going to make your x maximum positive pi. Now, the scale we should try to figure out by getting our quarter points, and also the y min and the y max we want to talk about a little bit here. So let's now go to the equation. The amplitude is 3. The frequency is 1 half. And the midline, because there's no midline in the back, the midline is the x-axis, which is y equals 0. So basing it off of that, if you visualize this, you know that you're starting at the midline of 0, which is the x-axis, and you're going to go up 3 units and down 3 units from 0. So the maximum is going to be positive 3, and the minimum is going to be negative 3. So for the y max and y min, it's okay if you leave negative 4 and positive 4 here because you'll see the whole graph, but it could also be written as negative 3 and positive 3 as well if you like. Now let's hit graph and let's see what we have. All right, as you can see, we have only a partial sine curve. It is not a full sine curve, and we're spotlighting it from the negative pi to pi range. So it's asking me, what is this graph doing over this interval? Is it decreasing or is it increasing? So if you look at it from left to right, if you press the trace button and you start all the way on the left here, what you're going to see is if you were to go from left to right, from all the way on the left at negative pi to all the way on the right at positive pi, the y values are continuously increasing. This is because the slope is positive the entire way. So the answer is choice 4, increases over the whole interval. Next one. This also was a little bit of a tricky one. We have a trig curve. This is a sine curve. Why? Because it says sine, but if you didn't know that, you would see that indeed it starts at the midline. How many sine curves do we see in this picture? Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you're not sure, remember one full sine curve would make one full cycle, one full circle, one full cycle. So this is 5 sine curves. 5 sine curves in the span of a 5 interval, an interval that is length 5. So what is the length of one curve? The period of one curve is basically just one of these guys, and that's actually 1/5 of 5, which is 1. So the period is 1. And notice that is choice 1, but that's not what they're asking you for, okay? They're asking you for the value of k. K is, if you do AFM, the k is the frequency. So how do we get the frequency? We do 2 pi over the period. 2 pi over 1 equals 2 pi. So the frequency is 2 pi, choice 2. All right, people, I think we're ready to culminate this in the form of a graph. So let's put our A, F, M in. This is a cosine curve, and they're specifying a restricted domain of what we are going to be graphing this curve over. On the side, let's write down our amplitude, our midline, our frequency, and our period, and our quarter points. I always start with my midline. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start at 5, and then I want to figure out what my maximum and my minimum are going to be. So to get the maximum, I'm going to do midline plus amplitude. So I'm going to do 5 plus 2. And to get the minimum, I'm going to do midline minus amplitude. So I'll do 5 minus 2. 5 plus 2 is 7. 5 minus 2 is 3. Why did I do this first? Because I want to make sure that I'm counting by the right amount. This is the x-axis here labeled, so that's nice of them. So I would recommend always graphing these in pencil. If we count by ones, let's see if we have enough room on the y-axis for everything we need. Oh, it looks like we do. So go to your y equals 5, which is my midline. And we're going to just sketch it out. Maybe use a dotted line here. All right, that's our midline. Now we're going to go up and down, 2 units up and 2 units down from 5. 2 units up from 5 is 7, and 2 units down from 5 is 3. So there's our maximum and our minimum and our midline. Now our period, our frequency is 1/2. Our period is 2 pi divided by 1/2. 2 pi divided by 1/2 is 2 pi times 2 over 1, which is 4 pi. So the period is going to be 4 pi. But they didn't ask me to graph one full period. They asked me to only graph from 0 to 2 pi. So we need to get the quarter points. The quarter points are period divided by 4. So if we take 4 pi and divide by 4, we get pi. This means that we're going to be counting by pi. So along the x-axis, I'm going to be counting. Let's do 4 boxes equaling 1 quarter point. So I'm going to do 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. But the problem is they didn't ask me to do one full curve. They asked me to only go to 2 pi. So keep that in mind. This is a cosine curve. Cosine starts at the maximum. It's a positive cosine curve. So we're going to start our maximum, which is 7. Circle that. And then we want to hit our midline at our first quarter point. Then we want to go to our minimum. And then we're kind of done. So we're going to connect the dots and see what we have here. And we only have 1/2 of a cosine curve. And that makes sense because the frequency is 1/2, indicating 1/2 of a cosine curve will be viewed in the 2 pi interval, which is what they gave us. Now let's check using our calculator. So using our calculator, we're going to go to y equals, and we're going to type in the full equation, 2 cosine 1/2 x plus 5. Close parentheses after the x. And then what you want to do is press mode, make sure you're in radian mode. Then you want to press window, and you want to make your x min 0, your x max 2 pi. If you want, you could make your x scale the quarter points, which is pi. Y min, you could do 0 because it looks like it starts here at 0, right? Y max, you can make like 10 if you want to match this grid here. And then you could hit graph. And there you go. This is indeed the picture that I have graphed. I'm good to go. Make sure when you're graphing that you graph the points that you can, representing the quarter points. Try to show counting out along the x-axis to establish a scale for the grader and the y-axis as well. So we know that there's a 1 unit along the y-axis, but on the x-axis we're counting by whatever the quarter points were, which were pi in this case. Now you guys try the next ones.